Welcome to the Exodus and Beyond. I'm your host, author R.J. von-Bruening. In this video series, we'll be exploring the Exodus from an esoteric understanding, as explored in my book, The Exodus and Beyond, Book 2 of Unlocking the Dream Vision. In this video, we will be looking at the historical evidence of the Exodus. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos. This series presents information based in part upon theory and conjecture of the system of esoteric symbolism. The purpose is to suggest some possible interpretation, but not necessarily the only one, to the many mysteries we will explore. Our journey into the Exodus begins with the two biggest questions concerning the great Exodus out of Egypt by the ancient Hebrews or Israelites as recorded in the Bible. With the first being simply, who were these people that became known as the Hebrews? While the second question simply asks, is there any historical evidence from any other sources that support the biblical story of the Exodus? Although many would say that there is no other historical evidence for the Exodus as it is recorded in the Bible, it has been well known by historians for hundreds of years that the early Hebrews in Egypt spoken of in the Bible were in fact the people known as the Hyksos. To the ancient Egyptians, they were also known as the Abaru Shashu, which we'll go into in a few moments. According to Josephus in his work Against Apon from the 1st century AD, he debates the similarities between the traditional Jewish account of the Exodus and the two Exodus-like events from the ancient historian Manetho describes. However, there has been significant debate over how Josephus and the works of Apon interpret Manetho and what he was actually trying to recount. Among historians, there is little doubt that Josephus identifies the Hebrew Exodus of the Bible with the first Exodus that is mentioned by Manetho. In this first Exodus, Manetho speaks of how 480,000 Hyksos, or shepherd kings as Josephus refers to them, left Egypt for the city of Jerusalem. Additionally, Josephus and Apon both recount a second Exodus that is also mentioned by Manetho. They speak of a legendary figure of ancient Egypt known as O-Soseth, whom Apon claims is the same as Moses of the Bible. The story claims that he was a renegade Egyptian priest who leads an army of lepers and leopardess priests against a pharaoh named Amenophis and drove him out of the country after this renegade priest allied himself with the Hyksos. This word Amenophis is a Greek word for an Egyptian term that means Amen is pleased. It was an ancient Egyptian phrase that was associated with the first pharaohs of the 18th dynasty and was not the name of any particular pharaoh. Historians and scholars also do not interpret the references of lepers and leopardess priests in the story as literally referring to diseased people, but instead a symbolic reference to a strange or unwelcome belief system by a foreign people. After the renegade priest and his followers had driven out the pharaoh, they are said to have ravaged Egypt, taking her treasures, her gold, her silver, and committing many sacrileges against Egypt's traditional gods and temples. Soon after these events, Pharaoh returns with a large army and expels them from Egypt forever. Towards the end of the story, Apon claims that the renegade priest changed his name to Moses and that he then leads the remaining 80,000 lepers and leopardess priests into the wilderness towards the city of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, there is no additional historical evidence to support Apon's claims that this heretical priest of the Hyksos changed his name to Moses, while at the same time there does not appear to be any evidence disproving it. Additionally, Josephus makes no mention of this claim in his work Against Apon. If it were a false claim, one would think that Josephus would have pointed it out and used it against him in his arguments. However, as we will shortly discover, there might be a lot more truth to this claim than scholars have traditionally believed. As we will learn, this second Exodus that both Josephus and Apon refer to appears to be a closer match to the Exodus story contained within the Bible, although most scholars claim that the first Exodus could be the actual event that's recorded in the Bible. There are many scholars and historians that agree that both Exodus stories, as presented by Josephus and Apon, are somehow related to the biblical story, but at the same time, these same historians tend to dismiss the idea that these accounts from Josephus about the Hyksos are actually related to the biblical story of the Exodus. I know it's a little confusing. The few that do believe that Josephus and Apon's reports are a historical account of the Exodus story that the Bible story is based upon from an Egyptian point of view tend to support the Josephus interpretation, with the first Exodus being the event that is actually the biblical story of the Exodus. Nevertheless, as we will now begin to learn, Josephus and Apons were correct to connect these stories to the Hyksos being expelled from Egypt with the biblical Exodus out of Egypt. Also in the process, we will learn that the event remembered in the Bible as the great Exodus out of Egypt by the Hebrews is the secret to understanding one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world and why there was a worldwide collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations. However, to understand this and so much more, we must first take a much closer look at the people the ancient Egyptians called the Habaru Sashu. It is believed by scholars that the word Habaru means wanderer. It also is known to mean dusty or dirty. The word appears to have been a common term used throughout the Fertile Crescent for people who were variously described as bandits, outlaws, raiders, and sometimes mercenaries. Habaru is the original Egyptian form of the word that will later over time become the word known as Hebrew. Now, the word Sashu is an ancient Egyptian word that refers to a group of Semitic-speaking cattle and sheep nomads that the ancient Egyptians had dealings with from time to time during the Middle Kingdom. We'll take a closer look at these Sashu here in just a moment, but even with these small pieces of information, it allows us to understand that the true meaning of this ancient phrase, Habaru Sashu, probably doesn't mean shepherd king as Josephus says, but is a term that is something much closer to meaning dirty wandering cattle nomads or shepherds or dusty cattle nomads that wander. What many may find surprising is we know quite a bit about these dirty wandering cattle nomads, which were commonly known as the Sashu to the ancient Egyptians and the people of the Fertile Crescent. Although the exact origins of these people are unknown, we do know that they were primarily composed of numerous small nomadic tribes that lived in and around the eastern parts of the Fertile Crescent. Thousands upon thousands of years ago, for some unknown reason, the great majority of all these small little nomadic tribes in the eastern parts of the Fertile Crescent, primarily located in the lands that make up most of modern-day Iraq and of western Iran and the many valleys of the Zagros Mountains, began to unite with one another. It is possible that this grouping together of these smaller tribes into larger groups were to help provide for the mutual defense of these people from the various powerful city-states, kingdoms, and empires that also occupied the lands in which they lived. It is also highly probable that intermarriage between the different tribes was also a major factor in uniting these different tribes into a much larger community. Nevertheless, no matter exactly how it occurred, this uniting of the together of numerous different small tribes into a much larger tribal grouping created an entirely new type of nomadic community. One of the primary factors that makes this nomadic group so vastly different from any other tribal group that had come before them or really kind of came after them was their large size due to this uniting together of numerous smaller tribes into a larger tribe that was made up of thousands, if not tens of thousands of members. This uniting into such a large group created an entirely new set of unique problems that a small individual tribe made up of only a few dozens or maybe even 100 or so individuals did not usually have to contend with as they scratched a living from the lands they occupied. One of the most significant changes that occurred was that they were forced to become a semi-nomadic people instead of a purely nomadic people as they had been for thousands of years. This momentous change came simply because it is challenging to keep a large group of people on the move all the time. Additionally, it also becomes very complicated to feed so many mouths while always on the move. This small change may not seem that significant at first, but in time it had a considerable impact on how these people lived and how they dealt with other groups. At first, the greatest change was this need to constantly move from place to place looking for food and resources, as the smaller tribes had united into one large group. They would instead move until they came to a rather lush area. They would then temporarily settle the area and live there until they had depleted all the natural resources and polluted it with their waste. This quickly became a constant repeating pattern of these people as they moved around. Once they had settled in a lush area, they would begin stripping the land of all its animals and edible plants for themselves and their livestock. This would naturally produce huge amounts of human waste and animal waste, which would then in time pollute the local water sources, making them undrinkable for man and beast. Once they had stripped the land and polluted the water, they would then pack up everything and move on to the next area and just keep repeating this pattern. The amount of time they spent in any one place was directly related to the amount of food and water available in that given area. This highly destructive form of living off the land would tend to leave the area as a wasteland for many years once they had left. This destruction of the local resources and polluting of the water sources was one of the primary reasons why other people tended not to like these people or want them wandering around in their lands. The next unique thing that happened with these people that make them so much different from all the other tribes of the ancient world that had come before them, and this major change, was that they had created and maintained an advanced military arm to protect the people and their temporary settlements. This change adds a great amount of weight to the idea that these people may have originally united together to help provide for their common defense against greater powers. And this military arm was vastly different than any of the other ancient tribal people or civilizations that had existed up to this point in time. What made them so unique was that this force was truly a professional army of soldiers made up of swordsmen, spearmen, archers, and stone throwers. Additionally, they were the first people known to have used the horse and the chariot. This also gave them a great military advantage that allowed them to stand against the much larger and more powerful civilizations that existed around them. They also created the first heavy mounted cavalry, and remarkably, they had also developed siege warfare to a high level. They were also the first people to develop highly advanced bronze weapons and then later iron weapons that gave them a great military advantage over other tribes and civilization. Not only did they have a highly professional and well-equipped army, but this army had the full support from the rest of the community without question. Their military advantages, the horse and the chariot, advanced bronze weapons, and then later iron weapons combined with siege warfare made them a dangerous foe to any and all of the city-states of the ancient world. This was especially true when they fought against the typical part-time warrior farmers that almost all the city-states called upon to fight for the various civilizations of the Fertile Crescent. This professional military arm also allowed these tribes to pillage, plunder, and rob just about any group they came into conflict with, and this was especially true when they ran out of food or other resources. They would begin to just take it by force. The ancient Egyptians viewed these Sashus as little more than bandits, than a gang of people just living off the pillaging of others. Over time, they became the basis of the ever-famous highway robbers of travelers remembered in countless ancient tales. Politically, they were organized by clans that were under a single tribal chieftain, which they commonly called king. This king was advised by and would have to get the approval from a council of tribal elders, which represented each of the clans and was typically dominated by the larger clans that made up the group. These tribes also had a very highly developed religious priesthood. This priesthood was an entirely separate class from the rest of the tribal group, and that they only answered to the gods. In time, this religious class came to maintain and control all the religious aspects of the community without question. The priesthood was always closely associated with the king and the professional army that he commanded. For it was actually the priesthood that gave the king the right to rule over the tribes and was actually the real political power behind the larger groups. It is unknown exactly which god the Sashu originally worshipped before they had entered Egypt, but the ancient Egyptians said they worshipped a god called Hadad. This god Hadad of the Hyksos is believed to be the same god that is known as Adad to the Babylonians and Assyrians. This god was a powerful weather deity and fertility god of the Babylonian and Assyrian pantheons. Scholars believe that numerous Semitic-speaking nomadic tribes in the Fertile Crescent had adopted this god Adad and several other gods from both the Babylonians and the Assyrian pantheons for their own tribes once they came into contact and traded with these major civilizations. Scholars and biblical historians have also linked this god Hadad to the Hyksos and the god Adad with the Babylonians and the god of the Hebrews known by his later name of Yahweh. The primary reason for this connection between the Babylonian god of Adad, the Hyksos god Hadad, and the god of the Bible is because they are all very similar to one another, with all having a common twofold aspect to them. This god was believed to be both giver and destroyer of life. The Babylonians said that this god was the god that brought the rains, which caused the land to bear grain and be fruitful, hence his title, Lord of Abundance. His mighty storms and terrible hurricanes and great floods were thought to be evidence of his vengeful anger against his enemies, whom he brought darkness, want, and cruel death to all that opposed him. He often became a god of war when his wrath was unleashed upon his enemies. He was also believed to be a highly jealous god that would punish any human or god that stood against him or disobeyed his divine commands. When the Hyksos went into battle, he became known as Yahweh Sabaoth, or God of Armies. As with the Bible, in both the Babylonian and Assyrian pantheons, this god became associated with divination and justice. He was also invoked to preside over the ancient ceremony where a religious figure interpreted the omens by inspecting the entrails of sacrificial animals or as a witness in legal cases. This god was also commonly invoked in curses and magical spells that were designed for protection. Surprisingly, this god of the Babylonians is unlike the other gods of the ancient world because he never ends up having an actual cult center just particular to himself located in one holy area. However, there is ample evidence that he is worshipped in Mesopotamia's most important ancient cities and towns, including the cities of Babylon and Ashur, the capital of Assyria, with there being several sanctuaries and a few temples built for him in both areas. Nevertheless, what makes him so different from other gods is that although there were many places of worship for him, and they were located at important religious sites, not one of them was an actual center for the belief, or were they just built for the worship of one god. An example of this can be found in ancient Babylonia, at an early center of his cult, a temple known as the House of Great Storms. This temple was located in an ancient fortress located on a river in western Syria. Within this temple, this god was the head of the local pantheon, but the temple was not built for his worship alone. This temple was a place of worship for all the gods of the Babylonian pantheon, in which this one god, Adad, just happened to be the leader of this particular temple. This is one of the aspects that makes this god a bit different than all the other gods, because he was commonly believed to be one of the most important gods within the pantheons. However, at the same time, he was only a minor deity, while it was commonly believed to be very important to the world's existence. Although he was believed to be an important god, he was not generally included with the highest ranking gods, nor the leader of the gods. Although there is a significant debate of the issue by scholars and biblical historians, we can see that it is very difficult to deny that the God of the Bible and the ancient Babylonian god of Adad, who later became the god Hadad, of the Hyksos are the same. If it was not for the Hyksos slowly moving into and then settling in the far eastern parts of the Nile Delta, starting at some time during the 12th dynasty of Egypt, this cult of Adad may have actually died out, returning to the immigration and settlement of these tribal people that eventually became known as the Hyksos to the Egyptians. The first phase of this immigration does not appear to have been violent or against the Egyptian wishes. By the end of the 13th dynasty, the Hyksos had grown in number and established an independent realm on the eastern Nile Delta centered in and around the city of Avaris. This independent realm slowly led to the formation of the 14th dynasty under the Hyksos in Lower Egypt and coexisted with the 13th dynasty of Upper Egypt. The establishment of the 14th dynasty by the Hyksos marks the beginning of the time known as the Second Intermediate Period of Egyptian history. Soon after the establishment of the 14th dynasty, the Hyksos invaded the rest of the eastern Nile Delta, where they also began to take over their fellow brother tribesmen living in the area, thereby creating the 15th dynasty of the Hyksos. They also invaded the territory of the 13th dynasty, which helped cause its collapse. That left a political power vacuum in Upper Egypt, which may have led to the rise of the 16th dynasty based in Thebes. The Hyksos eventually invaded both Upper and Lower Egypt, although for only a short time, and ruling from Thebes. After leaving Thebes or being thrown out by the local Egyptians, the 17th dynasty of the Egyptians retook control of Thebes. This new dynasty reigned for a short time in peaceful coexistence with the Hyksos kings of Lower Egypt, more or less acting as their vassals. What makes these events so important is how the Hyksos took over the area of the eastern Nile Delta and then eventually the rest of Egypt. The way they initially took over the eastern Nile Delta and then the rest of Egypt is so unique to these people that it can actually be used to trace their movements long after the Egyptians forced them out of Egypt. The takeover by the Hyksos begins as soon as they entered a new land. They would start to settle in an area with the largest number of tribal people that were similar to themselves. In the case of ancient Egypt, they settled in the eastern part of the Nile Delta known as the land of Goshen, centered around the ancient city of Avaris. Historians, Egyptian records, and biblical tradition all agree that this is the area where earlier waves of tribal people had been allowed to settle by the Egyptians. Once they had settled in the land of Goshen, they had taken over the city of Avaris. They began to take over the other existing tribes in and around this area. This process involved the killing of the tribal chieftain and his family, and simply the Hyksos would install their own chieftain as leader of this tribe. They would also begin intermarrying with the primary clans of these tribes, and which helped them take over and cement their control. Once they had consolidated their political power and established their control over the local tribes in this central area, the Hyksos began one of the most unique types of invasion and settlement ever seen in human history. They would begin by slowly invading the nearest surrounding villages and communities located around the city of Avaris. This appears to have been done by simply walking their army into a village or town and then killing the leader, his family, and anyone else that held any political power within the community. The Hyksos would then install their own people into those positions of power. What makes this Hyksos invasion so unique is that once they were in control of the local population, they would not change any of the day-to-day life of the local people. The new rulers would more or less leave everything intact, allowing the local people to keep using their same custom, laws, and traditions that they've always known. This same pattern of leaving society intact for the common people was seen over and over as the Hyksos slowly took over Lower Egypt. During this takeover of Lower Egypt, we also see another pattern that is unique to these Hyksos and how they dealt with the local population once the army had arrived at the gates of a small city or larger villages. If the Hyksos were welcomed and the locals quickly surrendered without a fight, the Hyksos would either require the local leaders to swear oaths of loyalty to the Hyksos king, or if they refused, they would simply be killed and replaced. If the local leaders swore loyalty to the new rulers, then the Hyksos would remove a few of the family members of the local leaders and place them back in Avaris to help ensure that the locals would honor their new oaths. They'd also settle a small group of their own people in the village and keep an eye on their new subjects. Once these events played out, everything would quickly return to normal for the average person of the lower classes. The only real change within the community that they would actually notice was that their new Hyksos rulers would require the community's cult center and its priests to be relocated to the central area of settlement, in this case, Avaris. This would have the effect of requiring the local population to go to the main site of the Hyksos settlement so they could give offerings and prayers to their gods. If the population put up a fight, the results would be vastly different. If the Hyksos had to conquer a village, they would always kill the rulers of the community along with anyone else who took part in the fighting. Afterwards, the Hyksos would usually uproot all the remaining people from the community and move them back to the central area of settlement, abandoning the site. If by chance the entire community took part in the fighting, then the Hyksos would show no mercy and would slaughter the entire community, leaving the bodies of men, women, and children where they fell, and then they would then destroy the buildings of the settlement, abandon the site forever. If the village was in a critical area or provided a vital service or resource, once the Hyksos had conquered and killed the elites, they would then remove approximately half of any of the remaining population back to the Hyksos central area, while settling an equal number of their own people in that community while replacing the elites with their own people. This unique form of invasion and settlement leaves distinct evidence that appears as if some communities and even regions were quickly depopulated for no apparent reason. This depopulation has the appearance of that some people had abandoned their villages in an incredibly short amount of time, leaving everything behind, while at the same time other communities were completely destroyed with only the dead occupying the burnt-out ruins. However, there were other areas that continued much the same way as it always had been, because the local population had peacefully surrendered to these people. These areas may have survived, but they tended to exist at a much lower level of advancement or economic activity once the Hyksos had taken control. This unique pattern of invasion and settlement is something that we'll see again and again as we go farther into the story of the Exodus. The next important aspect of this type of invasion is that it took place over a surprisingly long period of time. It was, in fact, a prolonged form of invasion and settlement. According to the historical accounts, this process took a couple of generations for the Hyksos to fully take over Lower Egypt in this manner. Based on these historical and archaeological evidence we have, it appears that the Hyksos were only invading and taking over a village or small community approximately once every year or two. One of the most important things the Hyksos did once they had taken over a community is they began reorganizing the local society into a unique way. They would start by breaking the people into three general but distinct groups or classes. The first class, of course, was the elite rulers of the tribe or village, normally made up the warrior class of the Hyksos. The second was the priesthood of the Hyksos that were always separate from the other levels of society, while everyone else was part of the lower classes that were broken into smaller groups, normally based around their occupation. They also began the practice of only allowing the sons of lower classes to enter into the same profession as their father. As we go deeper into the Exodus story, we'll see this establishing of this simple class structure several different times. The next important change that the Hyksos forced upon the communities that they took over was the moving of the religious cult centers and their priests of each community back to the Hyksos city of Avaris. This would allow them to control all the different cult centers of all the different communities. Once they had relocated all the local religious cult centers into one area, they would slowly begin to change the belief system by actually imposing their own, but not in the way that most would think. What is truly remarkable is they took great care not to alter the original religious belief, traditions, or rituals of the local people. However, they did reorganize the local pantheon of the gods into a new order. This always involved taking the local male fertility god, who was normally a minor god, and elevating him to being the supreme god of the local pantheon. They would then place the traditional Earth Mother or Mother Goddess along this new supreme god as his consort or wife. They would then take the local Lord of the Waters and place him as the king of the gods along with the local messenger god. They would then also organize the local mythology around the different gods and goddesses so they all appeared to be under the control of this new supreme god or one of the other two major gods, both of which were always in the service of this supreme god. In Egypt, this minor male fertility god was called Amun, more commonly known as Amun-Ra, the god of the sun, air, and the harvest. Amun-Ra was one of the most powerful and popular gods of the ancient Egyptian pantheon and was also the patron god of the city of Thebes. He was worshipped as one of the Theban triad of gods, which include Amun-Ra, Mut, and the mother goddess Kushushu, which I probably just destroyed that name, the god of the moon and time, and very similar in aspect to the Babylonian god Adad. Although Amun-Ra is normally thought of as the supreme leader of the Egyptian pantheon, he started out only as a minor fertility god and remained in that position until the time of the New Kingdom. It is during this time of the Hyksos ruling Egypt that this minor male fertility god was elevated to the status of being the god above all other gods, or the supreme god. By the beginning of the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, Amun-Ra had become the most powerful god in Egypt, and his worship bordered on monotheism. By this time, the other ancient Egyptian gods were all considered as only mere aspects of Amun-Ra or his will. During this time, his name was changed from Amun to Amun-Ra, with his priesthood becoming the most powerful in Egypt until the coming of Christianity. Although the Hyksos were able to accomplish much during the 100 or so years of the Second Intermediate Period while they ruled, in the end they were unable to complete their total takeover of Egypt. The primary reason was because the 17th dynasty collapsed abruptly, and soon afterward Pharaoh Ahmose I, who founded the 18th dynasty that ushered in the New Kingdom, began the long process of retaking of Egypt back from these shepherd kings. It took almost 100 years for the Egyptians to completely expel the Hyksos from their rightful lands. It is during this time of the Hyksos expulsions that Egypt and the great Exodus recorded in the Bible occur. According to Manetho, this expulsion of the Hyksos consisted of two separate expulsions that were many years apart from one another. The first expulsion of 480,000 Hyksos that is recorded by Josephus occurred once the Egyptians had retaken control of Upper and Lower Egypt. These 480,000 people consisted primarily of the lower classes of the Hyksos and their servants. It is what the ancient Egyptians did next that is by far more important to understanding the story of the great Exodus out of Egypt that is contained within the biblical text. Although the Egyptians had expelled the lower classes of the Hyksos, they did not expel the elites of the ruling classes of the Hyksos during this first expulsion. These Hyksos elite were to suffer a vastly different fate at the hands of the Egyptians and were eventually enslaved by them. One of the primary reasons for this enslavement was simply to humiliate the elites of the Hyksos as much as possible. By being aware of this critical piece of information that the ancient Egyptians enslaved the elites of the Hyksos begins to answer the mystery of the biblical account of the enslavement of the Hebrews, which according to the biblical story, the Hebrews were enslaved by the Egyptians and forced into hard labor for untold generations. However, we can now understand that this biblical story of the Hebrews' enslavement is most likely speaking of the enslavement of the Hyksos elite once the Egyptians had retaken their homeland. With this understanding that it was the Hyksos elite that were enslaved by the Egyptians, we can now understand that their enslavement would have been vastly different from the common person of the lower classes of society. Since they were from the elite class, it is safe to assume that their enslavement would not have consisted of hard labor, but is much more likely that they were turned into everyday household slaves, which then they had to serve their new Egyptian masters. As with the slavery itself, this was done to humiliate the Hyksos elite as much as possible. This humiliation of being enslaved as a household servant was done to deny the Hyksos elite a place in the afterlife. This is because within ancient Egyptian society, a simple household slave was so unimportant and of such low social standing that the Egyptians would not give them the honor of allowing their name to be written down, thereby denying them the chance of an afterlife because nobody would remember them. To the Egyptians and many other ancient cultures at the time, this was viewed as one of the greatest insults that a person could suffer or be subjected to, especially the elites of society. The very thought of not being remembered was a fate worse than death itself. This punishment is but one example of the lengths that the Egyptians went to so they could humiliate these shepherd kings as much as possible. This is the reason why there are no Egyptian records of this enslavement of the Hebrews that is spoken of in the Bible. It was simply because the Egyptians would not allow the Hyksos elite the honor of having their names written down so they could be remembered. In addition to taking the Hyksos elite as slaves, the Egyptians also took several technical and military advantages from the Hyksos. The Egyptians obviously copied their chariots as they copied their composite bows and advanced bronze weapons. The Egyptians also copied their advanced fortification and siege techniques and weaponry. The Egyptians also copied their advanced fortification and siege techniques and weaponry. The Egyptians also took all their livestock and crops. This helped to introduce new food that helped feed the ever-growing population of Egypt during the 18th dynasty. All these cultural advances that were taken from the Hyksos would become a decisive factor in ancient Egypt's later success in building a vast empire that controlled much of the Middle East during the New Kingdom. It also shows us that the Hyksos were much more advanced than a simple tribal peoples traditionally believed. Many may find it somewhat surprising that it appears that the Egyptians allowed the Hyksos elite to continue practicing their religion. Although the Egyptians allowed them to practice their religion, their worship and their priests could only be authorized and were allowed to practice under the ever-watchful eye of Pharaoh and his priests. This ever-watchful eye would need to be a type of individual that would be completely loyal to or directly controlled by the Pharaoh, but he would also need to be accepted by the Hyksos. This person ideally would be an individual from the most important Hyksos tribe or clan that was raised and trained from a young age by the Egyptians. Once this person had come of age, he would then try to re-educate the Hyksos in order to show them the errors of their way. This would have had the added effect of humiliating the Hyksos elites even more by taking over and changing their religious beliefs much as they had done to the Egyptians. This then allows us to begin understanding the events that led up to the second Exodus that is mentioned by the ancient writers, where a renegade heretical priest led 80,000 lepers and leopardess priests to rebel against Egypt to escape their enslavement under mighty Pharaoh. It also allows us to understand that the second exodus of the Hyksos elite under the command of a renegade priest are the events that are most likely recorded in the Bible and not the first expulsion of the 480,000 Hyksos. Additionally, this also allows us to understand that the claim made by Apon that this heretical priest eventually changed his name to Moses may be valid. If we take this information and combine it with the traditional biblical story along with our existing esoteric knowledge of the Dream Vision of Enoch, It will allow us to reconstruct a much more realistic chain of events that is remembered in the Bible as the great exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt, which we will explore in our next video. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and don't forget to subscribe for future videos.